Hi, everyone. Welcome to 2024. Happy New Year. Hoping that you all are doing well. We're going to be addressing the topic of the Demiurge yet again. This time, we're going to be looking at the Christian Demiurge. There is not only a presentation of the Demiurge in Genesis 1:1, but there is a bold presentation, proclamation regarding the Demiurge in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. We're going to quickly look at that. And again, this is a very bold presentation. It's very direct. It's not ambiguous. And so we see it in the book of Hebrews and it's in the Greek. And so we're going to check that out. And here you can see the Demiurge written out in the Greek. To get started with this discussion, we're going to look at Hebrews 11 and 10. Now, this is related to Abraham. And this particular passage is talking about him and the promised land. And so at 10, it indicates, and this is the KJV, the King James Version. It indicates, "For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God." Now, of course, if you've been following along, you know that the word foundation or foundations is also another word for set. We have some other indications related to set in here with respect to the builder and the maker, and we're going to look at how directly this ties into the demiurge dynamic. Now, this is presented this way so that you can see the entire passage on one screen. And so you can see here that the language is a little different when you are looking at the direct translation. And it indicates here he was waiting. This is speaking about Abraham. He was waiting for the foundations, having city of which architect and builder God. Now, sometimes there are words that are written and there's an indication that they can't be pronounced, all sorts of things. But anyway, so you see a couple of things like that here, and then you see some embellishments also. And so you see some things that are added. You see some verbs that are added. You see some articles that appear to be added. And so there's a little bit more going on here than what we see in the KJV translation. But we are looking at the translation here so that we can see word for word what is going on. And we'll also be able to see whether we are looking at verbs, whether we are looking at nouns, whether we are looking at singular, plural, masculine, or feminine. And here you can see it more closely. And we're just going to look at it in sections. And so one word I want you to make note of is foundations at the bottom. Now we're going to look at the other sections. Now, interestingly, there are a number of passages in Scripture that tie into these architect constructs, these masonry constructs, and this is another one of those indications. Now, what's interesting about this book of Hebrews is there's a little confusion about who wrote it. So typically, you might think that it's Paul who wrote it, and it does sound very Paul-ish, okay? But there's no clear understanding about who exactly wrote this particular book. There's no clear assertion about that. But you see this indication of foundations, okay? So that's one indication. You also see this kind of language in the book of Job quite a bit. And so we see foundations, we see city, and then we see architect. And of course, we see maker and builder, those constructs. Now, this is when we get to that bold proclamation. And so if you look over to the left-hand side, you can see more clearly that builder, that the builder is God. The word is the Greek of demiurgos. And in the English, this is demiurge. Now, make note of the fact that various words could have been used for this construct of builder, but the specific word that is used is the word that translates as demiurge for this word builder, for this construct of maker. And then you see in the Greek very clearly that it's theos. And so this indication here is suggesting the big God with the big G. Okay, but this God that is identified here is identified as a demiurge. So now let's look more closely at this translation and this transliteration in Strong's. This is at 1217. Now we are in the Greek, and so it looks a little different in contrast to the Hebrew. And so you see demiurgos, meaning builder, maker, creator. It's identified as a masculine noun. And here we see some other interesting dynamics related to demiurgos. And one is this idea of deo, meaning the public or meaning people. However, when you look at the Latin, so this is the Greek, but when you look in the Latin, deo is an deo, deus. That's another word for God. However, in this context, this word is being used for the demiurge and also for people. And so people in the public are being understood as deo. When you look down at the forms and transliterations, you see this interesting notation that this deo, the public, the people, this demigod of sorts, is also understood as demon. And so the public, the people, identified in terms of transliteration as demon or daemon. And here you can see it for yourself when you translate from the English, the Dio, into the Latin. You see very clearly that it's God, G-O-D. Now, when we look at Merriam-Webster, we can see a number of constructs that come out of that whole Deo or Demo root. And this is coming out of the late Latin, also borrowing from the Greek, this demiurge, this demiurgos. This literally means master of a craft, one who is skilled in an art or a craft that benefits the community. Because a part of this construct is this idea of a public servant, someone who is serving the public, someone who is crafting for the people, someone who is a maker, a creator, someone who brings something about. And so you see this in this etymology deconstruction here. And what you see here in this translation is that demiurge coming out of the English going into the Greek versus going in the other direction translates as demigod. The Oxford goes on to describe this demigod as a being with partial or lesser divine status. It's sort of a minor deity, a lesser deity, a deity that's below that master, supreme creator deity. This also could be understood as the offspring of a god with the small g, and a mortal that has been raised to sort of a divine rank. And here, when looking at this noun demigod, you see that it's an entity that is partly human and partly divine in terms of the nature. And so it's that combination of demi and God, in the Latin semi deus. And you also see that, again, it's this dynamic of possibly being the offspring of a deity. You see that a lot in Greek and Roman mythology. And here you see this demiurge dynamic in the context of a demigod as, again, partly human and partly a god. This might also relate to that narrative about the sons of God being with the daughters of man in the earlier scripture. And so this dynamic of the creation of this race of demigods. In terms of etymology, not only do you see demiurge related to demigod and this construct of demo or deo, you see that it also relates to the verb demonstrate. This will make more sense when you reflect back on some of our research and discussions related to Adam or Adam. And you see here that demonstrate, demonstrate, is related to the idea of Adam. If you recall, part of the definition of Adam or Adam was a vain show. That's what a human was considered, a vain show. And what you see here is point out and show. It goes a little deeper here, indicating that to demonstrate is not only to point out or exhibit something, but also it might come from this idea of a divine omen, and also indicates that one should look at the word monster. And so this construct of demiurge is tied to a number of other constructs. And here we see this dynamic of the monster. And so monster referring to this idea of a divine omen, a portent, a sign, okay, a monstrosity, something that is awful, an abomination. And of course, this is tying right back to that daemon or demon that we see in the root of demiurge. It's also related to this idea, interestingly, of to think. And then relating back to all of those ahs, hova, hava, kava, you see this idea of calamity, terror, distress, and oppression. And so this is tying right back to those entities that are described in the Old Testament. And interestingly, this word or this construct of daemon ties right back to Set and is related to this idea of to divide something, to split something, to allot something. It indicates here an evil spirit, a malignant supernatural being, a divider, a provider, and also related to fortunes and destinies. And we've talked about that before. Now, of course, most people are not taught that the creator or the deity in the Old Testament or the creator or the deity in the New Testament, they are not taught that these are related to anything like a demiurge. However, you see this in a very bold fashion again in the New Testament, where the entity is defined as demiurge. The demiurge is the God that is related to Abraham. This ties right back to the narrative related to Abraham and the Almighty. And so, again, these are all referring back to Set yet again in one way or another. In this case, however, in the Greek, it's just more boldly presented. And so it's not ambiguous. It's not a lot to think about. You don't really have to do as much exegesis because it's really sitting there in your face in terms of the word, the construct that is given for that writer's understanding of God, G-O-D. In this instance, it's with the big G. I'm going to leave you with the thoughts of Stevie Wonder, wherein he indicates when you believe in things that you don't understand, you suffer. And that is the case with some of the invocation that is going on with these deities that people are not understanding. They are not even understanding that they are invoking or calling on or calling forth these various deities that are inconsistent with the deities they believe they are calling forth. Remember, knowledge is power, and hopefully you will get even more of it in 2024.